Welcome to the Kentucky History Channel, where we strive to bring you all the Kentucky history content you want and you deserve. Kentucky is a part of all of us, and we plan on covering all the history we can, from Pike County to Fulton County, from Louisville to Harlan. Here on our YouTube channel, you can find many videos dedicated to different events, people, governors, and places in Kentucky. There's something for everybody. While you're here, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification button so you get notified anytime new Kentucky history is available. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page as well, or patreon.com/kyhistorypod. Welcome back to the Kentucky History Podcast. I'm your host, Jameson Cable, and I'm here with a very special guest, Dr. Gwynn Henderson, who's the Education Director at the Kentucky Archaeology Survey. Dr. Henderson, how you doing?
I'm doing very fine. Pleased to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, it's been a little bit of we've been planning this for a while, and it's finally worked out.
Yeah. I mean, I look back over my notes that we had during our conversation. That was in June.
Yeah.
Right? It was in June. But hey, there was archaeological field work to do.
Mm-hmm.
School started.
Mm-hmm.
Soccer practices, everything, life gets in the way of life, as it were. So
Yes.
It's all good.
Yes.
And it just gets older, right?
There you go.
The History Channel, it just gets older. It's 6 months older than it was if we had done this in June. So it's not a problem, right?
So it's even more valuable now.
That's right.
Well, Dr. Henderson, before we get started, tell us a little bit about your Kentucky connection and that sort of thing.
All right. I had never been in Kentucky before I came to Kentucky in 1977. I had been hired to work on an archaeological project in Louisville, southwest Jefferson County, flood wall project. They were putting in a flood wall, and 4 very important archaeological sites along the Ohio River were going to be destroyed by taking the soil for fill for the flood wall. And so I had gotten a job on that project, and I came to Kentucky. The folks that I was working for were the Department of Anthropology at the University of Kentucky. And I was considering in a year or so going to graduate school for my master's degree. And making a long story short, I came to graduate school at the University of Kentucky. I got my master's degree. The archaeology of Native Americans in this state is so fascinating. So many unanswered questions. And the folks that I was going to school with and working with were so friendly and so fun to be with that I stayed. And then I went back in my 40s to get my PhD at UK. I perhaps should be fully transparent. I met my husband on the archaeological dig in 1977, and he's an archaeologist. And I think part of the reason why we stayed in Kentucky, in addition to the archaeology that was so fascinating for both of us, was that he was able to get a full-time job at the Kentucky Heritage Council, which is the State Historic Preservation Office. And so one of us had a real job and the other one had a part-time job. And so we look back and realize we've been here for so long. It's not like something we planned, right?
Yeah.
But the research we've been able to carry out and the people we've worked with and the things we've discovered and places we've been, Kentucky is an amazing place. And at this point, I can't imagine having done, archaeology really anywhere else.
Mm-hmm. Well, I like how you phrased that. The archaeology was really spectacular. And you also met your husband.
Yeah. There's got to be that kind of personal thing, right?
Yeah. Well, so let's get into it. We've talked a little bit, a few episodes over the past year about the Shawnee about the Cherokee and about some of the Native American tribes and so forth.
Mhm.
But let's get into the archaeology. What's so unique about Kentucky's archaeology, I guess?
I think that for me, the uniqueness of Kentucky's archaeology stems from the fact that it's sort of in a crossroads of Southeastern archaeological traditions and Midwestern or Ohio Valley archaeological traditions.
Mm.
That's one. So that would be a north-south coming together of different traditions. But then there's also the east-west. Western Kentucky, for anyone who's lived in Western Kentucky and come to Central Kentucky, or anyone who's lived in Eastern Kentucky and come to Western Kentucky, you'll see an incredible change in geography. From west to east, you've got the Purchase area, which really is the Mississippi River Valley. And then you have the coal fields, and then you have the bluegrass and the knobs, and then you've got the eastern mountains with the Cumberland escarpment. And each one of these environmental zones, environmental regions, has its own special take on the Native experience, in the past. And then to add another element to that, it's time. Okay, so if you think of archaeology, archaeology is all about space and time. Time with the layers of deposits being built up at an archaeological site, and then space, the patterning across the horizontal space. Well, Native peoples lived in Kentucky for millennia. And so the combination of space and time and regional differences means that there are many different stories to be told, depending on whether you're talking about farming peoples in Western Kentucky or farming peoples in Eastern Kentucky. Whether you're talking about hunter-gatherers in Central Kentucky or hunter-gatherers in the mountains. And do you mean the early hunter-gatherers or the later hunter-gatherers or the gardeners? So there's, if you're an interested young person wanting to explore archaeology, there is something for everyone here. It's amazing diversity. It makes it a big challenge, though, of course.
Yeah.
To understand.
Yeah. And so when you're looking at those different regions, you then, I mean, and I don't know if there's an answer to this question. You talk about it merging and changing time-wise, and when time. How far back do we know of people in Kentucky?
Right. We know that Native peoples were living in Kentucky at least by 9,500 BC. The evidence of those people, as you might imagine, because they're mobile hunter-gatherers, and not a lot of them to begin with, there's not a lot of evidence. And it's been such a long time, it's difficult to find. But knowing where to look and being very fastidious in your research, you can find the evidence of these ancient Native peoples in Kentucky. 9,500 years ago, Kentucky didn't look like the Kentucky of today. It was more like Canada. And that's because this was towards the end of the Ice Age, right? And so the ice, the edges of the glacier at that time weren't in Kentucky, but we weren't really that far away, as the mastodon walks, we're not that far away.
Yeah.
So with the temperatures being the way they were and the natural environment being the way it was, with evergreens, like firs and spruces, and open grasslands and so forth, and the different kinds of animals that were there, because when Native peoples first arrived in Kentucky at that time, there were still the the giant animals called megafauna, right? So there were mastodons and mammoths, giant beavers, and huge bison and giant sloths. And evidence of those animals are found. This would be paleontological evidence of the fossils. Evidence of those kinds of animals have been found. Well, I guess the best example is at Big Bone Lick. Big Bone Lick. So they have evidence of those large animals, and native peoples were hunting those, but also there were smaller animals too that they were hunting, and of course gathering wild plant foods and stuff. But that's a long time ago.
Yeah.
That's a really long time ago. And we've had 9,500 BC. Okay, so add 2,000, that's 9, 10, 11. So it's 11,000, like 11,000 years ago, right?
Yeah.
So you've got 11,000 years of erosion and flooding and changes in environment, and then with the arrival of the historic period, all the roads and housing and cities and everything. So finding evidence of these people is difficult, but it's there. And archaeologists have found excellent evidence in Western Kentucky around Christian County.
Yeah.
In sort of central Kentucky in Marion County, and in eastern Kentucky in rock shelters in I can't remember what Perry County. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I'll bring this up just from personal experience. We go to Pine Mountain a lot, and with my students in the past, and they have the site there that native artifacts were found by a girl who was in trouble, and they just sent her away, and she was just out there, and she found all these bones and all this stuff, and they ended up, the University of Kentucky came down and excavated it and all that stuff, and they found a whole bunch of neat artifacts. But that during that program that they talk about it, they kind of mentioned how large some of the animals were that roamed around during that time period.
Well, if you can imagine something that and everybody has seen, or I'm going to assume everybody has seen, reconstructed images of what mastodons and mammoths look like, because they're like woolly, hairy elephants, right? Well, an elephant is big enough, right? But these things are twice as big as an elephant. So you're looking at something, 2 stories high. A human being is minuscule, in relationship to that. And so you have to have an awful lot of respect for indigenous peoples who were hunting these animals. This is before the spear thrower, okay? So there's no spear thrower, there's no atlatl yet. It's simply a spear. And you're using the force of your arms, to spear this animal. Having said that, a single person, it's kind of ridiculous to do that. So you think about how these folks organize themselves in hunting parties. And I've heard some folks who specialize in studying this time period, which is called the Paleo-Indian period. And they talk about how while we will focus on these folks hunting these huge megafauna, in truth, it was probably a situation where people often picked off a small one, right? Like a baby or something, or an old one that couldn't run fast enough, that kind of thing, pulled that out, and hunted it down. It's, we imagine that they're going after these fully adult, very ferocious animals or what have you. And in truth, the suggestion of the reality, as is often the case, reality is a little less fantastic. But still, I just can't imagine, being up against an animal like that And I also have heard folks who study Paleo-Indian time period say, yeah, you probably only got one mammoth in your whole life, and you told stories about it and embroidered on that for the rest of your life, which I thought was, you know,
Yeah.
you know, because from a certain perspective, that animal gives you bones,
Mm-hmm.
it gives you skins,
Mm-hmm.
it gives you meat, it gives you sinew.
Yeah.
So you have an enormous resource right there for multiple purposes. I don't know if in Kentucky, archaeologists have found tools made from the tusks
Bones.
of these
Oh yeah.
animals, or not, yeah, or the
Yeah.
bones, right? I'm not exactly sure, but elsewhere in North America, they have found such things. So
Yeah.
it's a storehouse. I mean, I guess from a certain perspective, it's sort of a walking grocery store and hardware store on 4 feet would
Yeah.
be
Well, yeah.
mammoth.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and like that. I mean, they used that. I mean, and I don't know specifically to this time period and so forth, but eventually they use organs and that sort of stuff as well.
Yes, like the organs would be useful as I've heard people talk about turning animal bladders into bags. So yes, using the organs too. Every piece, every part um, was a potential food or
Tool.
tool, food, equipment, that kind of thing.
Hmm.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's one thing. Like talking with my students about um, native cultures and so forth.
Mhm.
They use everything because it's all about survival. You know, they all they of course want to think about they warred and fought and all this kind of stuff. But that didn't happen. But like their main thing is survival, and it's not the way you're thinking it
No,
is.
no, exactly. And I think that this image of warlike indigenous people throughout Native history is a stereotype and a misnomer, really. Or then you want to think about human history throughout time is about war and fighting. So Native peoples are not unique in this. But I think it's for whatever reason, perhaps movies, with cowboys and Indians, that kind of thing, or it's more romantic to think about that, and kind of pedestrian to think about people getting up in the morning, eating food, going out, finding food, sitting around the campfire, telling stories, dancing, singing. People just don't even think about it. There's this this misconception of indigenous people as somehow different,
Hmm.
right? As significantly different human beings, and that's not true. I mean, they may, like, for example, these Paleo Indian folks, sure, they're living in a different environment. And they have a different way of life than ours. They are hunter-gatherer, nomadic people. They have to be mindful of where their food is coming from. They can't just go to the grocery store and get it. And the issue of storage for them is also a concern because you don't have a refrigerator. So if you have too much meat, you put it in the refrigerator and you come back to it. Of course, they would have been smoking meats and drying meats and carrying them with them. So it seems on the surface to be such a different way of life, and it is.
Yeah.
But when you drill down, Jameson, different into what it is to be a human being and how life is lived, everyone has family, everyone has belief system,
Mhm.
everyone wants to be cared about. There are political animals and social animals. There are healers. There are marvelous people and there are no good guys, right? So the the diversity of people that we experience in our lives today would be the same kind of thing, back then. Singing, dancing, being sad when your parents die, that kind of thing. Concern when accidents happen, that kind of thing. And I think part of the compelling story for people to remember about Native peoples and Native history is that these are human beings adapting to their environment, living together, doing the best they can for their family. And that makes them so very similar to us, even if the trappings of their lives seem so very different,
Yeah, yeah, and you think about, like you mentioned, um, the thought that they're warring or fighting, and it kind of popped in my head, like, if you think about the frontiersmen back in those days, even up until probably might be like 1900, like the people that were considered honorable, or the people that children maybe looked up to, were people who went to war, people who fought in battles,
Right,
and
right,
that was their, to say it this way, the people who were idolized, the people who were
right,
successful war people.
right.
And then, obviously over the probably past 100 years, that's changed a bit, and people look up to athletes and that kind of stuff a bit more. But
Right, exactly. No, because even you're right, even in the mid 20th century, after folks came back from World War II, right? If you were a veteran, if you had fought in World War II, you were. I remember my dad telling me that when he got back from World War II, if you were still, you hadn't been de-enlisted yet, right? You could go anywhere, and if you had your service uniform on, people would thank you. They would. He said, if you had to hitchhike, you could always get a ride because, that was a serviceman, that kind of thing. And I think you're right, Jameson. I think the Vietnam War um, changed a lot of that, but still, people who excelled at politics and conflict resolution
mhm.
were, you're right, the ones that people looked up to.
Yeah, yeah, and
Well, as well as the elders, right?
yeah,
So elders who were a part of every culture, they were looked up to. The healers, so that would be, like our doctors today. So the healers, the shamans, the religious leaders, the elders, the folks who were politicians, the ones who were adept at fighting. Those were all folks who, you're right, who were respected and looked up to by folks. Well, and still are,
yeah.
honestly.
Well, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So a little bit back onto the archaeology side of things.
Mhm.
Is there a place, or I mean, it's like you said, it could be all over Kentucky.
Mhm.
If someone was to want to research or look into, where is the archaeology hotbed of Kentucky, I guess, to say it that way.
Well, it's everywhere. If someone was interested in going to an archaeological site, there is a state park
Mhm.
in Kentucky that is an archaeological site purposefully interpreted for visitors, and that's Wycliffe Mounds out in far western Kentucky. Wycliffe Mounds was a town
Mhm.
of farming peoples in the 1300 AD. There were platform mounds where their chiefs lived. There was a town of houses there, a plaza, a burial ground. This place was excavated many years ago, and then the excavations were roofed over So when you go to Wycliffe, you can see where the excavation was done, and there are marvelous murals that depict life at Wycliffe Mounds when these native farmers were there. So that's a marvelous place to go and see firsthand that kind of link to our heritage through an archaeological site. I would say that on most of the state parks, well, all across the state, there is evidence of native peoples having lived there. For example, the hunter-gatherers, the earliest ones are Paleo-Indians. The more recent folks who lived from 8,000 BC to 1,000 BC are called archaic people. Because they moved around a lot, they left things behind all over the place. So you could have one group of people moving seasonally, as they did, leaving stuff everywhere. And so you would have hundreds of archaeological sites where they had camped, or made stone tools, or that kind of thing. So because so much of Kentucky is private land, however, you can't go to these places.
That's right. Well, yeah, that's right, I guess.
Private land. Now,
Yeah.
I will say archaeology is among the featured information at Mammoth Cave. So it's important for folks to know that native peoples explored Mammoth Cave. Any place a cave archaeologist goes, native peoples have been there before.
Yeah.
And they didn't have the lanterns, and they didn't have all the crampons and all that kind of stuff and all the ropes.
Yeah.
These people had cane torches and footwear made from a plant called rattlesnake master. They carried gourds filled with water, and they explored Mammoth Cave. So in Mammoth Cave, there are places where they left petroglyphs, which are stone pictures that they had pecked in the stone. They went into Mammoth Cave to mine selenite, which is a mineral that is found on the walls of the cave.
Okay.
And selenite is a kind of diuretic. It can be used as a source of a raw material for paint. And there are there's lots of evidence of cave mining by native peoples. They would have brought in tough, sturdy freshwater mussel shells and other tools to scrape the selenite into baskets, and then take the selenite out. I don't know if they traded the selenite or not. Certainly, you can only find this stuff in a cave. So if other people in other parts of Kentucky or the region were interested in this kind of stuff, it would be a kind of thing that could be traded. It would be difficult for an archaeologist to find evidence of that because the stuff would have gone away, thousands of years ago. Okay, another thing that archaeologists have discovered in the caves is that based on the research in paleofeces in the cave, they are entertaining the possibility that the cave was also used, or caves in general were used by native peoples as ritual sites, and that perhaps some of these caves were used for male coming of age ceremonies based on the biological research of cells in paleofeces. There are other caves in Kentucky that have these glyphs as well. So and not used just during the early part of the woodland period, which is beginning around 1000 BC. Native peoples later in time also used these caves. So caves were an important place for Native peoples, and their use of caves is interpreted at Mammoth Cave.
Yeah.
And people can find out about Native people's use of caves there. The Big Bone Lick State Park has interpretation of Native history there. But in terms of hotbeds of Native use and habitation and living and so forth, there are there are places everywhere.
Yeah.
Underneath our cities,
Yeah.
In the mountains, in places that you wouldn't even think, rock shelters, open sites, on the floodplains, on tiny creeks, big rivers. The evidence is everywhere. Some of it is buried so deep, like, for example, the archaeological sites that I came to work on first in Jefferson County. The first one that I worked on was a deeply, deeply stratified site. 25 feet, down, there were still evidence of Native peoples having lived there, tiny little bits of fragments of chipped stone tools. And that was because living right next to the Ohio River with the floods, and so it built up over time. The information that that project was able to collect about changing stone tool, changing spear point shapes over time, intensity of use of that particular place. And then the geoarchaeologists also were able to read the soils and infer how the Ohio River had backed up at times, which part of the reason why there was such a buildup of soils. So the archaeology excavations at sites and the interpretations and research at sites takes archaeologists, but it takes geologists and soil scientists and people who specialize in stone tools and pottery and plant remains and animal remains. It's a host of specialists, right, that work together to help tell the story of a particular place.
Yeah. Well, that's one thing. We're going to try to get into is looking more at those archaeology and the people who were here before, the Cherokee, the Shawnee, those sorts of people. We had Dr. Stevens on a few episodes ago, a little while back, and he was talking about how the Fort Ancient people,
Yes.
but we're not even talking about them. We're talking about
Ancient.
before.
That's right.
Way
No,
before even them.
way before even them. That's right.
Yeah.
And I think it's important for people to know that the Fort Ancient people, who are the village farming peoples of central and eastern Kentucky, and the Mississippians, who are the town and mound building farmers of western and southwestern Kentucky. Those folks are the descendants of those gardening peoples, who are the descendants of those archaic hunters and gatherers, who are the descendants of those first people who came into Kentucky at 9,500 BC. So there's this connection, and what that means is then that the Cherokee and the Shawnee, the Chickasaw, the Tutelo, and other groups that we can't name now because they perished during the pandemics in the 1600s. are connected, have this incredibly deep, deep connection to this land and the history of Native peoples in this place.
And Dr. I said Dr. Stevens. I meant Dr. Stephen Warren is,
Oh, yes,
you
Steve Warren. Yes,
know,
yes,
um,
yes.
but yeah, and it's just fascinating how, and I say this, not to put anybody down or anything, but just how fascinating our history is so brief. We just look to a certain point, and that's kind of where we're like, okay, that's what it was. But then there's so much more, and not to be using archaeological, the layers of the history.
Right.
There's even more. I wanted to get more. Um, Topics and focus on Native Americans and those tribes and
Mhm.
so forth. But then now you realize there's even more before that that you
Right.
don't know about it, or you don't. The history books don't really get into that much.
No,
Well,
they really don't. And I think that's that's all of our loss, right? I think it's important for every one of us to know the long expanse of human history in this place.
yeah,
And if we were to look at a timeline, you would see that European, African American, Asian American, Hispanic American time is short in comparison to the millennia of Native American
hmm
that represents the history of this place, right? Of Kentucky, of this place.
hmm
And while time separates us all, I mean, even from the folks who lived in Kentucky in the early statehood period,
yeah,
it's the place that we all share.
yeah,
It's it's the place, the environment, the location, the rivers, the resources, and that kind of thing that we all share. And sometimes I think to myself, if somebody had set up, a podcast like this in a place, in one place, and started it at 9,500 BC and
yeah,
just kept it running, you
yeah.
know, kept it running and edited it as time went on,
uh-huh.
you we that's how close we are to these people, really.
hmm
It's just time. The
Yeah,
place is the same. And it's been my experience as a non-native Kentuckian that place is so important to folks who have been born and raised in Kentucky. They're proud of their state. They're connected to it. They they love the land, and it's the same land that the native peoples loved too,
yeah,
and frankly still love.
yeah,
These folks see this rightly as their ancient homeland. It is their ancient homeland, and irrespective of the fact that in the early 1800s, federal Indian policy forced them to leave their homelands,
hmm
it doesn't mean they would ever forget it,
yeah,
right? And
yeah,
not feel a connection
hmm
and a significance to it.
yeah, yeah. Um, it's just fascinating. I mean, it is.
I've gotta I've gotta agree with you. I totally gotta agree with you. I will say sometimes that history books can take the spirit and excitement out of it. Sometimes they end up being, um, a little less than interesting, but, um, that doesn't mean that it isn't interesting. We just have to go to different places to find it, right?
Yeah,
We
yeah,
we need to go to the state parks where Native, uh, history is interpreted. We need to read other books about Native history, like Steve Warren's book about
mhm,
the
mhm.
history of Shawnee people and so forth. So, there are there are places to find it. You just
Yeah,
have to be intentional about it.
yeah, yeah.
Be intentional about
Yeah.
it.
Well, we're gonna stop right there with our discussion with Dr. Gwynn Henderson about Kentucky archaeology, and we're gonna pick up next week, and we're gonna answer a big question on, did Native people live in Kentucky. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time. Welcome to the Kentucky History Channel, where we strive to bring you all the Kentucky history content you want and you deserve. Kentucky is a part of all of us, and we plan on covering all the history we can, from Pike County to Fulton County, from Louisville to Harlan. Here on our YouTube channel, you can find many videos dedicated to different events, people, governors, and places in Kentucky. There's something for everybody. While you're here, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification button so you get notified anytime new Kentucky history is available. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page as well, or patreon.com/kyhistorypod. You've probably heard about Daniel Boone, but what about the rest of the frontiersmen who came to Kentucky and settled? That's what we want to bring to the Kentucky History Channel. The stories of the untold, the stories of those forgotten. One thing to expect on our channel is great Kentucky content. Some stories that you've never heard of. The Night Riders, who began in western Kentucky. Bloody Monday, the riots in Louisville. The assassination of Governor Goebel, the only governor ever assassinated in the United States. Stories from all over Kentucky, stories that are unforgettable once you've heard them. You can find out who counties in Kentucky are named after and how your county got started. From beginning to end, we plan to document every county in Kentucky, all 120. Reach out to us on all of our social media platforms. Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And also leave a comment on one of our YouTube videos. You can also check out our podcast episodes. You can subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and many more. We're always seeking to find more Kentucky history so we can bring it to you. The viewers, the listeners, we want all the stories and all the events from Kentucky's great history to be told and shared everywhere.